amazed that Tintin managed to not truly be canceled, whereas Dr. Seuss is definitely canceled.
No, Katherine, be right back. I'm selling out my entire Schwab portfolio, and I'm just buying Tintin books because apparently they're going to go from $10 to $500 tomorrow.
They will. They will.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm just going to hold Bitcoin and Tintin books. That's my entire net worth. Yeah.
What is the first 30s for people who are unfamiliar? What's like the 1-minute version of how Dr. Seuss got canceled? How like what was the impetus? And
well, he started it, didn't he? Himself.
Well, I would just like to say Erik is a racist for asking the question.
Yeah, exactly.
This is gonna be a fun room.
Exactly.
Okay, hold on. Sorry. This is again my PM. Like we're rabbit holing in some weird little detail. This is like when the data scientist starts the meeting and he goes into some weird little quantity detail that nobody wants to hear about. All right, how about we just introduce the guests and take it from there because I think the room is filling up.
Antonio, go for it.
Go for it.
Oh God. Okay. So Matt, I think we've been online acquaintances for a little bit now. I was on your podcast, which was very enjoyable. I have to say, one of the funnest podcast appearances I've been on. And I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. If it had sucked, I would have told you. But it was actually quite fun, and your co-host actually is a total riot. But you sir are hard to classify in our modern age.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
You dinged my former employer Goldman Sachs and declared it to be a vampire squid, which is probably true. That said, that vampire squid has certain upsides to it that we don't have to get into now. But and then your books have run the gamut from sort of the anti-Trump circus, almost like a Hunter S. Thompson on the Nixon bus vibe, which is what I got out of that book, and then sort of Hate Incorporated, which went the other way, and which was the sort of left also leaning into that level of sort of hyperbolic, sort of virality seeking. And your early books were actually published by Spiegel and Grau, which is a kind of progressive book imprint. And then now you're like enormous on Substack. Like I was actually reading some of your Substack posts before this, and like the comments of your Substack have more engagement than like 98% of tweets. It's incredible. You sir are just a lightning rod of attention. It's incredible.
Is that true? I don't even know how you would measure that.
Matt, this is what's called false modesty. Don't tell me you don't just sit there and fucking reload your Substack stats like every hour.
Well, some of the stats I certainly do, but I don't really know how to measure the comments. But
your voice is crackling, which means you're lying, Matt. That's actually not true at all.
Giveaway.
None of what you just said is true at all. But it's fine. We appreciate false modesty here on Big Ideas. In any case, hopefully that was an informative intro for everyone.
I would love to hop in and when I think of your career, I think of you as one of the journalists who lived the golden era of journalism. Like you started your career in Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union, moved to Uzbekistan, got deported from Uzbekistan, which is probably a whole conversation in and of itself. But now you're on Substack, and so it's like you lived like everyone's journalism fantasy, and now you're on like this new journalism fantasy. I would love to hear, how did you make that leap to Substack, and what was it like?
So a few years ago, when Substack was just starting, the two guys, Chris and Hamish, approached me and asked if I could contribute. And at the time, my contract at Rolling Stone prevented me from really writing for anybody else unless it was a book. So I decided to serialize books on the site. So I'm one of the first Substack contributors. This was years ago. And I actually wrote two books. I wrote Hate Inc. that Antonio mentioned very generously, and then another book called The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, which is just coming out in print now. So I was familiar with Substack going back quite a long way. And then, they were always kind of in my ear about leaving Rolling Stone for good and switching over full time to make the leap to, a fully subscriber-based life. And obviously I have 3 kids, so that was a very scary decision. But they helped sort of smooth the way last year. And I finally decided to do it in about a year ago this week, actually. And part of it was because I wasn't really unhappy at Rolling Stone, but I just kind of had a sense that the business was moving in a certain direction. And so unlike a lot of the other Substack writers who I think a lot of them were forced out of their situations, I kind of went voluntarily. But it turned out to be this amazing thing, and I did not at all expect it to work as well as it has. It's been the response has been great, but it's also just been incredibly fun to do in a way that I didn't expect.
So I love hearing the story because I think, so I was a reporter at the Washington Post for a few years before I left for tech. And, when you're at the Washington Post, this is like the cheesiest thing, but people used to always say, make sure you go in the front door. Don't go in the side door of the Washington Post building. Go in the front door because it's the newsroom where, this is where we discovered Watergate. Like you need to walk in the front door and know you are working at the Washington Post.
Wow.
And it's sort of like a cult in many ways. I mean, it's like that's what you're getting paid in, is this idea that you're doing something with gravitas. And so I'm curious, the nostalgia that I think kind of old school newsrooms and old school magazines like Rolling Stone provide. Did you have any sort of nostalgia, or was it just like, of course I want to do something new. Of course I want to hop and try a new business model after, magazine business models have been failing for the last 10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what a crazy, do they really say that? You want to go through the front door?
Totally. People are like, you work at the Washington Post, walk through the front door. And it's like this very, it's democracy dies in darkness. It's very serious, it's like we're doing
Right.
God's work here. But that's how they can afford to pay journalists $45,000 or $50,000, whatever it was when I was working there, because you feel like you have something of gravitas. So I'm very curious if it doesn't sound like that played into it, but I'm curious what it was like, hopping from a legacy publication to a new one.
Well, I had a lot of emotional attachment to Rolling Stone. I grew up. I never wanted to be a journalist. My father was a reporter, so I grew up around newsrooms my whole life, and he was a television reporter in Boston when I was a kid, and I was really not terribly interested in the business growing up. I wanted very badly to be a novelist, and I actually wanted to be a comic novelist when I was a teenager. I read all of these Russian novels, and that's what I wanted to do. But I started kind of late in my college life to read Hunter Thompson, and so it was the idea of going to Rolling Stone, and they hired me initially to do basically that exact same job, which was to cover the campaign for Rolling Stone and write these first-person comic accounts. And I thought that was, it was a tremendous honor, and I was really, really attracted to that. And when I was at Rolling Stone during that period, it wasn't exactly the golden age of the magazine, which was probably in the 70s, but it was still doing. It was a booming time for the magazine, definitely. So that was all really exciting. But the business, I think everybody would agree, the print business has been dying financially at a pretty rapid rate, especially over the last 10 years. And one of the editors there talked to me about how sad he was, how it felt like he was just managing the decline. And that's kind of what it felt like. We were all just sort of waiting for the end. And I think, even though I had some attachment to it, there was a sense that there was just nothing left really to wait for, that it was time to move on to something new. I'm sure, I don't know if you had the same feeling, Katherine, but that's kind of how mainstream journalism looks to me. Like it's gonna change into something else or die, I think.
Yeah. No, and I didn't have the luxury of being a famous journalist. I was just a poor and starving one. But it was basically an economic question for me, where my editor said, "We're going to be laying people off. Your type of journalism is probably not going to make it very much longer, so you might as well look at another career." And
Wow.
I think in some ways that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because I was, a tried and true sort of print reporter, and even saying you're a print reporter is sort of a legacy term now. But it was definitely difficult. I think in the 2010s, and it's interesting to see a lot of the newspapers and I would say too, like there's certain magazines that have actually come out of it because the political culture sort of inspired this resurgence of people being interested in news again. But we'll see how long that lasts.
Yeah, people are really. It's funny. Even Rolling Stone, inside the magazine, they talk about how nobody reads about music anymore, but they read about politics probably more than they ever have. So there's this tremendous audience appetite out there for content about politics, which is I don't know if it's healthy or not, but it's definitely a thing. But the kind of traditional way that we used to do reporting is just kind of dead. So it's tough to stay attached to that model.
So Matt, it's funny. At the same time, you were getting pitched by Chris and Hamish of Substack. I probably was, and unlike you, like an idiot, I totally ignored what they said and did not actually take Substack seriously.
Why?
Because I'm a fucking moron, dude. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Let's not get into it. I'm looking at one of your posts, and like you have more comments and engagement on a single post than like most viral tweets. Can I ask you one question, Matt? I know this is completely inappropriate, but I'm Latink, so I can get away with this. The last name Taibbi, where are you from? I'm pulling like the white redneck thing. Like, where are you from? Where are you from, Taibbi? Because you mentioned your father, so I'm like, wait a second. So where's he? Who's his father?
Tell us about your lived experience.
Yeah, it's also my lived experience.
Oh, yeah. This is great. I've never gotten to tell about my lived experience. So my father is Hawaiian and Filipino. He was an orphan, and he was adopted by an Italian family from New York. So Taibbi is actually a Sicilian name of Arabic descent, and I'm neither of those things. So,
dude, Matt, you're totally shitting us. Is this actually your family story?
Yeah, it is.
This is the most convoluted thing I've ever heard. Okay, all right, interesting.
So it's funny because a lot of people think that I'm Lebanese because Taibbi is actually it's both a town and a word.
That's what I thought. I thought you were Levantine, either Syrian or Lebanese. That's what I thought. Huh.
Yeah. Apparently, there's even a Taibbi beer somewhere in the world.
Oh, that's great to have the name of a beer. That sounds amazing. I'd love to have that.
Yeah, I think that's a cool thing. But my father's basically Filipino, and my mother's Irish. So
Jesus.
Yeah. So, but I have a Lebanese.
So where does that leave you? Drunk and hankering for poke? I don't know. What does that mean? Yeah.
I don't know. I remember there was.
Sorry, I'm actually trolling Katherine, who's Irish, and I'm very proud of that fact.
Oh,
it's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm used to it.
Yeah. I remember there was somebody told a joke once at a comedy club that the guy was saying he was half Irish and half Italian, which meant that he liked to fight and he could.
Well, that could be applied to many activities, I suspect. But yes, in any case.
Matt, I'm curious. Over the past year, I'm curious. Have you watched, some of your peers still at their, at their sort of media companies and ask and say to yourself, oh, Matt Iglesias will be where I am 6 months from now, or name some other writer. And I'm curious, just broadly, if you could contextualize your sort of political evolution in the sense that it doesn't seem that there's a huge overlap between people who are writing about the Vampire Squid in the time of 2008 and then people who are, sort of like praising, or reviewing Christopher Lasch and sort of lambasting, Herbert Marcuse. How do you contextualize that?
Well, in terms of the first question, I think it's funny. I don't know how in touch you are with people in the news business, but there are rumors flying in basically every company. There are internal squabbles, and there are certain people who are not going to be there for very long. So it was kind of an open secret that Andrew Sullivan and Matt Iglesias were going to be out the door. There's certainly some other people who fit the description, and there's a much bigger tier of people who maybe aren't as prominent in terms of their names, but are struggling to kind of deal with the office culture and stay because it's become very monolithic in most newsrooms. So, which leads me, I guess, to the second question. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Katherine.
Oh no, I was just going to say, can you elaborate on that? Because I think like you're someone who has been in the news business for a very long time. You've sort of seen it through various iterations. When did that change start happening, where it became very clear that certain types of contrarians or certain types of even writers? I mean, I think like you're someone who has a very distinct style of writing. That I think would be very, in some ways very difficult for certain publications to publish. So I'm curious, like, when did you start seeing that happen in newsrooms?
That's a really good question. I think, once upon a time, I think when my father was coming into the business, most of the people who came into the news business once upon a time were usually screw-ups and rejects who dropped out of some other endeavor that they had failed previously, and so there were a lot of people who came into the business, and they were, it was normal for somebody to be a contrarian and to be an individualist and to have trouble with authority. That was actually the kind of the standard psychological profile of a journalist in the 70s and 80s. You think of somebody like Seymour Hersh, who is the polar opposite of a team player. I mean, he has no allegiance to anything except his work, and I mean that in a good way. That was the ideal that I think that most of us grew up with once upon a time, and for instance, I interned for another investigative reporter when I was a teenager named Wayne Barrett, who was kind of a legend in New York, and he was very much like that too. It was just his own person, and that was normal. And now it's completely different. For somebody to not be on board with what everybody else thinks is highly unusual now. It's frowned upon, and I think it's a development that really started with Trump. I don't remember it being like that before. In my own career, and this gets to the question that Antonio asked, when I was writing about Goldman Sachs in 2008, 2009, most of the time it was considered a positive that I was criticizing both Democrats and Republicans in the Wall Street coverage, and it was considered an attribute of a good journalist to be able to look in all directions. And then all of a sudden in my career, I just noticed that same approach was no longer welcome. And I think that for me, I noticed that very strongly, and all of a sudden in the summer of 2016, as the Trump-Clinton race heated up. So I think that's kind of the moment where I think it all changed.
So it's funny to hear your description, Matt. It's almost like Substack is like Dante's Inferno for writers, right? Like you go there, and in the afterlife, you actually meet the interesting people from the golden age, and like nobody actually reads the Paradiso because it's boring as shit. No one actually wants to.
Paradiso is no. We'll disagree on that at another time. Paradiso is, I highly recommend.
I mean, Katherine, you're very Catholic, and I suspect you might actually end up there. But I suspect Matt and I are not exactly going to be booking the penthouse anytime soon. So so we're going to end up in the Inferno. But I think frankly it makes for better conversation. So it's just funny that the Substack leaderboard is like the Dante's Inferno of the East Coast media world in a way. It's like, oh, there's the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and the so-and-so, and there's Petrarch, and then there's somebody in Purgatory and all the rest of it. That's fascinating. But so can I quote a paragraph at you? I was reading up, Matt, when I was eating my steak. Can I quote it? Because you mentioned the Trump inflection point, which I think is interesting. Sure. So can I read you at you without you sort of curling up in a ball in awkwardness?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so this is at the end. You really don't like Rachel Maddow, apparently, because like half your posts are like screens against. Not that I've ever seen her show, because I don't own a TV and I'm actually anti-TV. But anyhow, to keep it up, elite media made the same request of audiences that Trump regularly made to his own fans. That was what was said and done 10 minutes ago be forgotten in a world where only the present mattered. Memory became taboo, present conflict, the only allowable orientation, a utopia of division.
Yeah. Well, I had to go big. That was the ending of a chapter. So.
I mean, you have 1,700 comments, so I suspect you succeeded in that post.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, look, this is a book about how the modern media business is structured around disagreement, right? So, you're asking about when the change happened, and in the prior era of journalism, when we were kind of in the CBS and NBC, ABC space, where there were only a couple of big organizations, the goal was usually to go for the whole audience, and then they switched over to a new model in the internet age where everybody was sort of seeking out individualized demographics and trying to dominate them. And the way we do that now is just by picking a group that we don't like and then feeding our audience news about that group that we know that they're going to gobble up. And everybody does that. And in that space, it becomes impossible to have any orientation except anti all the time. And so even somebody like me who, if you read Insane Clown President, it's extremely unflattering to Donald Trump. I don't like the guy at all. But I found it really difficult to try to live in this space where that's the only thing you can say. When a thing becomes mandatory, I think it becomes meaningless, and that's kind of what happened, I think, during that era. I don't know if you agree. I mean, or what it looks like from someone outside the news business, but that's what it felt like for sure.
Are there any moments that you can point to, like you said, like when you were covering the 2016 election? Was there like a moment where you realized that the window had shifted? Like, was it an editor who came to you and said, actually, you can't write like this anymore? Or was it the feedback you were getting from your readers? Or like what was the moment where you realized that this is changing?
There were a couple of things. I remember I was traveling, I think, with Trump in the summer. I think it was in August of 2016. And there was a lot of talk on it wasn't even a bus anymore. There were so few reporters covering. That's an interesting little side story. There used to be in general elections like whole planes full of journalists who would follow the campaigns around, and by 2016, nobody could afford that anymore. So it was really like a minivan full of journalists that was following Trump around. But anyway, they were having a discussion about the relative size of the two campaigns' crowds, and Hillary's crowds were much smaller, and Trump's were enormous. And a lot of the discussion in the bus was, well, we can't present that like it's a negative, or else that will impact the race. And so basically the consensus was that they had to downplay that story, or they had to, and there were other things like that where like the poll numbers were suggesting something negative for Hillary, and there was kind of a collective effort to overlook that news, because now everybody agreed that the most important thing was to make sure that Trump lost, and that was a new thing. I'd never heard reporters talk like that before. Like it was one thing to sort of privately, have political feelings, right? But it was a completely different thing to have that affect the way you do your job. There was that. Then there was this other thing where I wrote a story where there was kind of an offhand line in there where I was interviewing. This was after the Access Hollywood tape, and Trump was disinvited from an event in Wisconsin that he was supposed to do with Paul Ryan, and I went to that event that didn't have Trump at it, and I interviewed this guy who said he was a lifetime Democrat. He came from a family of union workers, but he and his family felt betrayed by NAFTA and some things like that, and so that's why he was going to vote for Trump. And I put that in my article, and I got all this blowback on Twitter from people saying it was an example of the economic insecurity argument, which was bogus, And now, essentially what I was being told was that the only explanation you could put in a story for Donald Trump's campaign was racism, which, I always thought was an element of it for sure, but even a strong one, but it wasn't the whole story, So those were two things that stand out. I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but.
But then, Matt, so, but how do we understand, I mean, not your politics exactly, but your reaction to this is what? Is it the principled feeling that, in some sense, the fourth estate is there to objectively, or at least non-subjectively, report the truth, and you felt they were actually sort of putting a finger on the scales? Or in terms of your reaction to the reality of it, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I had two feelings about this that were, two reactions that were very strong. The first one is that I think the press loses all of its institutional power when it's no longer perceived to be separate from politics. So it gets, all the influence that we have comes from the idea that people perceive us as being a check on political parties. And the instant that we're associated entirely with a political party, we lose our ability to influence anybody, including that particular political party. And so I thought the way, I wrote an article in that summer basically saying the future is going to end up being Democratic media reporting on Republican corruption and Republican media reporting on Democratic corruption. And that's not a system that can really function. Like there has to be this perception of separateness, or else the job becomes absurd. And so that was one thing that I was reacting to, and I've been trying to push, is this idea that we have to be seen as standing apart. And the other thing is, we lose all of our credibility when we get things wrong. And there were a number of stories kind of early in the Trump era where I think, there were a lot of mistakes. And one of the things that happens when you become politicized is that it disincentivizes organizations to be careful, because they know their audiences will forgive them as long as they're kind of directionally right about criticizing, somebody like Donald Trump. So this ethos that as long as we're harsh towards Trump, it's okay to be wrong about Trump, I thought was just incredibly dangerous. And so that was, I reacted was pretty strongly to that, and particularly with regard to the Russiagate story. And to a lot of people, it seemed like I was making this big heel turn to the right, but I really don't see it that way. I see it as having the same approach that I always have, but it just doesn't resonate as well with other people in the business as it used to.
Well, yeah, Matt, I mean, you haven't moved to the right. You've stood still, and the world's moved to the left, I think. But in any case, but where I would take issue with what you're saying, Matt, and where I would disagree with you, is that in some sense, the media can actually gain in credibility by getting things wrong the right way, right? Like I've written about this before back in my my journal LARP days, about how this whole, what you're citing is actually the media objectivity standard that's been the case in the United States for the past, I don't know, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. You go back to Lippmann in the 20s. And what I would claim is that that's basically deprecated, that's kind of obsolete. And we're going back to the sort of pre-modern age in which, the newspaper, the Press Democrat, was literally like the press for the Democrats. And in fact, media sources were actually, in some sense, sharded, or striped, basically designated by their political party, right? And that, in some sense, that view is kind of a dated one. And we're actually going back to like the 19th century when it comes to journalism. That would be my view on it.
That's probably true. I just wasn't raised to think like that, and also it's probably just part of my character. Like, there's something that I find offensive about.
No, to be clear, man, I think you're correct. Like, I think your view is the correct one. I just don't know that it's the Humean is-ought duality that's going on here, right? Your view, I think, is the ought, and then the view I just stated is the is. And Yeah, those are different. But to be slightly optimistic about it, look, I mean, our democracy was founded in a period in which journalistic objectivity not only didn't exist, most journalists would actually have argued against it. And in fact, you can actually cite passages from 19th century journalists who, in fact, argue against this sort of both sidesism as this horrible threat to democracy, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I used to pick on objectivity. If you go back and, not that anybody would bother, but a long time ago, when I first started writing about the media, I used to laugh at, the kind of New York Timesian notion of objectivity and the ridiculous, monotone delivery of the anchors on television, and I always thought it was phony. This whole idea that we're going to give X amount of time to this side and X amount of time to that side. As I wrote about in Hate Inc., that was really a commercial strategy that was founded by CBS in the 30s with their radio broadcasts. Their advertisers wanted them to do it that way, to play it down the middle so that they could get the biggest audience share. But I also think, you can be objective in like the real sense, and not in the sort of phony stylistic sense that the press was for so long. And what I mean by that is that you have to be able to be fair and even-minded, or I guess that's the wrong term, but you have to be willing to look at things in a non-doctrinal way, right? So, just because the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is going to take a particular line on an issue doesn't mean you have to follow that. You have to be able to call things as you see them, and sometimes you're going to see them in a way that's politically unpopular. And I think the press needs to do that. Like, we're just not believed when we're seen as taking positions just because that's what's politically expedient. And so that's what I worry about.
Can I go back to something you said earlier, which is that, journalism used to be this sort of place for misfits and weirdos and contrarians, and maybe the kids who got like straight D's in high school ended up being journalists. And I think of that because I think of a piece that you wrote on the comparison between Trump and pro wrestling, that I think you understood in a way that the vast majority of our elite press just would have never understood, because none of them grew up in normal, like, working or middle class households and had ever watched pro wrestling. And I say that because, like, I when I was a writer, I was on the culture desk, and like everyone on the culture desk was like a legacy of another time where, of course, you grew up watching like really bad television, because how else would you like know how to report on your jobs? And I'm curious if like something happened in journalism that made it impossible for these very elite students out of Harvard and Princeton to really understand even the political currents. And if that's part of the reason why we are where we are now in terms of journalism, like, because it's such an elite profession at this point, of course you're going to, report that the size doesn't matter, because how could Donald Trump ever beat Hillary Clinton? But you were someone who saw that, like, actually that could happen if you'd watched professional wrestling. So I'm just very curious if that is something that you've seen over your career that you think has kind of lent itself to this weird time that we're in with journalism.
Katherine, can I just salute how you actually called the middle and the working class normal, and actually the baseline? It actually is revealing your roots, and not the professional managerial class. But anyhow, sorry, go ahead, please, Matt. Sorry, No,
that's great. I think that's the crucial point of all of this is there was a huge shift in who became journalists. Actually, in between my father's generation and my generation, and when he was coming up, it was very common for the people who worked in journalism to be the sons and daughters of electricians and plumbers, and it was more like a craft or a trade than a profession. There were almost nobody from the upper classes wanted to be a journalist. There's a famous joke that Walter Winchell apparently told, where somebody asked him if he was still in the news business, and he said, yeah, but don't tell anybody, my mother still thinks I'm a piano player in a whorehouse. But then I think what happened was, after All the President's Men, and some of the other, the sort of rise of Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe and Terry Southern and some other people. Journalism became a sexy profession for upper class kids, ironically like me. I mean, I was one of those people. I came out of a prep school in Massachusetts, and by the time I got to news, and especially by the time I was covering like presidential campaigns, when you went on the plane with John Kerry, I would say probably 60% of the people on the plane had gone to an Ivy League school, which was amazing, and almost nobody came from a working class background. Whereas once upon a time, it was standard for every news organization to have their lead columnist be kind of a working class voice, like a Mike Royko or a Mike Barnacle, or I'm blanking on the names from New York, but that was the idea, and that class change has really accelerated even since the time that I came into the business. Now it's just basically entirely kids who came from upper class backgrounds. And I think that makes it very difficult for people to understand, what's going on. And especially if you look at the Trump phenomenon, the New York Times basically admitted in 2016 that, we don't know how to cover the other half of the country because we're not there. We don't know anybody who lives in that world. And I think that's a huge problem. They kind of pretended to address it by, I guess, hiring Bret Stephens, or I forget what the move was. But that's I don't think that's really a solution. It's obviously a deeper problem than that. And I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are, Katherine and Antonio, about what they can do about that, because they don't seem to be making an effort. Actually, interestingly, I know of at least one news organization where somebody brought up in a diversity and equity committee meeting the idea that they had to bring in more people from other classes or from the military, and that led to an HR issue at that organization because that person brought that up. So that's how toxic that idea is in the news business right now. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wonders, I think there's a lot of talk about sort of the ideology and newsrooms, but I do think that there is a huge problem of just the changes going from working class, where it's kind of you understood what was happening in all of America, to this sort of elite mindset. I don't think it works with the business model for most of the elite publications. Like I think the Washington Post and the New York Times do very well preaching to the elite and to those who want to be part of the elite. So that's fine. But it's interesting to me because I think, the most interesting stories to come out of 2016 through 2020 were by people like you, who really understood what kind of normal culture, like if you didn't understand professional wrestling, if you didn't understand even the legacy of Trump and sort of his history and sort of even the talk radio sort of like wink, wink, where we have a certain way of saying things, then you really couldn't understand the political culture. And what's interesting about political journalism is that because those beats are the most coveted beats at the New York Times and the Washington Post, you're getting all of the Harvard grads who have probably never watched TV in their lives. It's like the kids who graduated with a 4.0 and were super nerdy and this is all they live for. But they're certainly not making comparisons to like popular culture. And we had a popular culture president. So that's where I think, the question for me is like going forward, I think that a lot of our political elite, even if you look at AOC, it's people who really understand popular culture, yet we don't have a press that's really ingrained in popular culture, really understands a lot of the tools that even I think our next generation of politicians are going to be using.
That's an interesting point, because I think you're right. It works for them. Like, the Times, what do they have? 7.5 million subscribers now, right? So what they're doing is basically writing, political fan fiction for an enormous segment of America's wealthiest people, probably, and that works for them. They're doing a relatively booming business doing it. The problem is that they get a lot of things wrong because they're doing that's not the right way to do the job. I don't think so. It's kind of a paradox. The way to financially succeed is probably not the best way to do the actual work, which is I just don't know how they're going to break that pattern.
Matt, in the spirit of sort of the question of how sure are we that this is new as opposed to just a very old mask dropping? Have you read Walter Lippmann on forming public opinion and manufacturing consent? And what do you think?
I have not. No, I've read Manufacturing Consent, but I didn't read Walter Lippmann. What's the idea that you wanted to discuss there?
Well, the broader question of just how new this all is.
I do think it's new. I mean, the class change. I think the class change is a huge thing because historically the press has always been. It was never an elite, profession. It was never something that the very wealthy really went into. If you go back to the beginnings of American newspapers, usually the newspaper doubled as the printer in a village or in a town. So it was somebody who was also making other kinds of things that were printed on paper, and that that family also happened to write up the local news and go to the town meetings and other things like that.
And also get the contract to the Congressional Record. So part of the reason, again, pre-20th century, that newspapers kept themselves in business was actually getting the state contract to publish the state Congressional Record. But just to elaborate a little bit on Erik's point about Walter Lippmann, he wrote a book called Public Opinion, and he was sort of the inflection point between the previous journalism I was talking about that was obviously completely partisan and
right.
subscriber based. And his weird reaction was a reaction to the sort of very propagandistic reaction to World War I, and obviously non-objective reaction to a lot of that, saying that no, journalism needs to be like an actual postgraduate degree. That's where a lot of the journalism schools actually started, University of Missouri, Northwestern, Columbia, et cetera, right around teens and 20s, and said, no, this needs to be a profession almost comparable to like business or law or whatever. And it needs to be the fourth estate that takes a role and actually records history in a disinterested way. And that was kind of the beginning of it. Of course, more important than the philosophy was the economics of it. Macy's needed relatively nonpartisan news to advertise in with a broad market, right? And that was part of what propelled it as well. But that's kind of what Erik's referring to there. And again, I would claim that we're actually regressing to a pre-Lippmann model right now, where that is basically gone. And I think, Matt, you are like, what's the strange fish, the coelacanth, who was found in South Africa? It's like a Jurassic fish that they pulled up. It's like, wait a second, how is this thing not extinct yet? I think, Matt, you and again a few of the other Substackers are like the coelacanth of the high point of Western journalism. And now we're past that period, I think, Matt.
That is an incredibly flattering description. I remember seeing that fish at the Agassiz Museum in Harvard, actually, pulled out of the Indian Ocean, if I remember correctly. Right.
Matt, you should be an exhibit in the museum. Oh wait, that actually just closed down, and then they literally dismantled it piece by piece. But, yeah, that's an inside journalism joke, but yeah.
Hey, Matt, if everyone currently at the New York Times was taken out, it was no longer at the New York Times tomorrow, and the whole staff was rehired, would anything be different?
Probably not. Because that's not true. That's not fair. I think there's still a lot of really terrific reporters who really know how to do the job, who are still at these institutions. I'm thinking particularly like of the Washington Post expose on Afghanistan that came out last year. There are still plenty of people who know how to do this work, and there's a lot of institutional knowledge that you'd lose if they did that. What is true though is that there so much of what they do that is the bread and butter of their financial business is incredibly simplistic and very far from the more difficult kind of work that used to be done at those places. there's a lot less emphasis on the foreign bureaus. So you don't have the lifers who spend their time in the Middle East or in Jakarta or in China. There's less of an institutional emphasis on stressing those stories and putting them on the front page and being a leader and that kind of thing. What they're really good at now is hot taking and getting in the middle of sort of internet-driven controversies, which is I guess is what everybody's trying to do. But you don't need to have 20 or 30 years of experience and a giant Rolodex full of sources to do that. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen within the business is that building up sources is not even really a thing anymore. Most people just kind of they link to stuff to support their work. So yeah, it's a really interesting question though, for sure.
Matt, everyone you just described is going to get defenestrated in the next 5 years. Let's be clear. And then also like this business of foreign reporting, speaking a foreign language, understanding a foreign country. Look, Americans are involved in their own cold civil war. They don't want to hear about, the real coups happening somewhere. That's old news. That's like watching the British version of The Office. It's like, why don't you just watch the American version? I don't understand. What is this bizarre foreign obsession of yours?
That's so true. Definitely. I mean, working as a foreign correspondent in Russia was my first introduction to how screwed up.
Wait, sorry. So did I understand correctly, Matt, that you got deported from Uzbekistan? What does it take to get deported from Uzbekistan? What do you have to do? Because it seems like one of these shady countries that you would have to sort of struggle to actually violate the laws to the point that you actually get put on a plane. Can we talk about that, or is that a touchy thing that we don't?
No, it's fine. So this is at the very beginning of my career, and I was trying to do anything possible to get published, and I had moved to St. Petersburg and was trying to be a stringer for a bunch of news organizations there, and was not able to sell anything to anybody. So I had this idea that if I went to an even more remote place where there were no other stringers to compete with and just waited for something to happen, that I could actually get published. So I did that. I moved to Uzbekistan, and there was an earthquake not long after I was there, a pretty big one actually that I was in the middle of, and so I filed something really short, I think, for the AP, and that I guess put me on somebody's radar, because the next day, and the interesting subplot to all this is that I was actually playing baseball for the Uzbek national baseball team.
Oh my God! I like how this plot is thickening. This is amazing.
Yeah.
Wait, can I interject? Because did you also play basketball in Mongolia? Were you like many sports, or did I make that up?
No, I did. That was later. I played at the
Jesus
Mongolian
Christ!
Basketball
Oh my God!
Association. And yeah, so in Uzbekistan, they had a team. Well, they were trying to start baseball teams all throughout the Soviet Union after the collapse, and Uzbekistan happened to have a whole bunch of Cuban students who were
They would, of course.
I think they were studying medicine, but those guys could really play. So I was on that team. It was really funny. Like, we had a game against Kyrgyzstan, and the game was played in a pasture, and the ground rules were that if you hit a cow, it was a double. And if you hit a sheep, I think it was a triple. It was something like ridiculous like that.
I mean, they're smaller, so it makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. It's a true story. I'm not lying about that. So anyway, I came back. I came home from practice in my cleats, and there were agents from the in Uzbekistan was called the SNB, the Sluzhba Nacionalной Bezopasnosti. So that's the old version of the KGB in Uzbekistan, and I got the full-blown like interrogation under the light bulb thing, and they asked me who I was, and of course I was not there on the proper visa, and I didn't have permission to be doing journalism, so they put me on a train out of the country, and that was it. So, but
that was for publishing the story, or hitting the triple off the goat, or like what was?
It was just for being there and being unsupervised and not having the proper documentation, and they obviously just spotted something that I think by then I had written 2 pieces. One was about the earthquake, and the other one was about the first Independence Day of Uzbekistan. And there was like a one-line mention that there were some complaints about human rights violations by the regime of Islam Karimov. So that might have been the thing that actually got them upset. But
Matt, that's a totally JV move. I did the same thing. I was reporting from Cuba without a visa. The point of, dude, is you pub after you leave. You don't pub when you're there. You're just sitting there asking for it. I mean, obviously you got to bail before you send your editor the thing. I mean, okay.
I know. I wasn't thinking clearly, but I was only 21. I didn't know what I was doing. But that was a very weird but very interesting experience, and a good way to start the job.
Sure. Matt, when you were talking about journalists with multiple decades of experience of expertise, who it would suck to if they were no longer there, it would be a shame if that happened to Don McNeil, huh?
Well, I mean, yeah, there you go, right? I mean, that story's so amazing because the casualness with which they'll throw away somebody who, it takes a long time to build up the kind of sources that he has and the reputation, and it opens a lot of doors, and they just kind of toss it out the window over this ridiculous complaint that I know they know is ridiculous. It's clear that they know it's ridiculous, but they're in a state of paralysis and they can't. So the whole situation with the business is absurd right now. It's like something out of a satirical novel, or a dystopian one. But they don't know how to get out of the pattern, and that's true at Rolling Stone as well. It's true everywhere.
What were you thinking when you read his apology? Were you thinking, oh, this man has Stockholm syndrome, or not apology, but sort of the 4-part piece that he wrote? Like,
look, everybody who's canceled does that. I was canceled. I wrote one. It's part of the Soviet ritual that everybody goes through. You pledge your allegiance to the state, and you throw yourself at the feet of the general secretary and hope he shows mercy, and but it never works. You always end up against the wall anyway, and I think people are eventually going to start tuning into the idea that the apology is not necessary because it's not going to help, and I think that will be an important turning point. But there was a Kurt Vonnegut novel called Galapagos, where every character who was about to die was marked with an asterisk, and as soon as McNeil apologized, I could see the asterisk next to his name. So.
That was one of Vonnegut's better novels, actually. I'm a total Vonnegut fan. I've read all of them. That was actually one of his under-acknowledged books.
Love that book.
Yeah, it's an amazing book.
Mm-hmm.
So we're sort of dancing around the types of censorship that have happened, but you actually were one of the first people to write about literal corporate censorship, and it's top of mind for me today because I think we were joking in the beginning about how Dr. Seuss has been canceled, but eBay actually removed Dr. Seuss, and it's a parody of itself, but Amazon has done the same with certain books, and I know you wrote about Abigail Schreier's book. I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what's happening around the kind of newfound banning of books, and how far you think censorship will go, particularly at the corporate level, because we've seen, deplatforming of Parler, and that's a form of censorship. But I mean, we're talking about literal banning books on the world's biggest bookseller. So I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, that's an amazing topic. I was one of the first people to do an in-depth story about this. If you go back I think it was in 2018, it was after Alex Jones got tossed off all those different platforms, and there was a moment where Facebook, which had teamed up with the Atlantic Council, just sort of quietly announced that they had zapped 800 accounts, which I know is nothing, but and I guess the crime was coordinated inauthentic activity, and probably a lot of those accounts were bot accounts that were improper in some way, but a significant number of them were actually real, small businesses. Some of them were little political blogs that had invested a lot of money and time over the years building up their audiences and had bought well over $100,000 worth of Facebook ads to try to boost their publicity, and they were just wiped out in an instant as part of this this mania that was building at the time about Russian disinformation. Right, it wasn't about other kinds of disinformation at the moment. And I remember I convinced my editors at the time to let me do a story about that. But I remember being shocked by the total lack of interest in that topic among other journalists. Because, for me, I thought I saw right away that this was going to be really dangerous for anybody who's in the publishing business, anybody who publishes articles. The complete arbitrary nature of it, plus the subtly dangerous thing that was made evident with the Alex Jones episode was the way that it was coordinated, right? I mean, it was clearly a thing that had been worked out between all these different companies and who were acting at the same time. And if they had the capability and the will to do that once, they were definitely going to do it again. And what did that mean? It was a completely new type of factor that we've never had to deal with in America. We've never had a national media regulator of any kind, and this in a sense was going to be it. But since then I ended up writing a story about it, and Rolling Stone was I think so worried about how to sell a story that seemed to be anti-censorship, that they actually wrote the article, that the headline they put on the story was "Who Will Fix Facebook?" Because I think they wanted to appear as if they were saying that there's a misinformation problem on Facebook and we have to fix it. So that was the prevailing sentiment in the business, that the problem wasn't censorship or this new form of authority. The problem was, all of these little blogs and Russians and right-wingers and anarchists and whatever it was. And I think that's only progressed. And now we're at this stage where, I don't even know where it's going to go. I'd be interested to hear what you all think about this. But I think it's a terrifying moment, and people, I feel like they're being incredibly naive. And I don't know if ignorant is the right word, but they just don't seem to grasp how dangerous this moment is. Or I don't know is that an overreaction or not? I have no idea, actually.
It's interesting because I mean, there's always been state sort of concerns about books in libraries. I feel like that's been a long running, this book was banned from whatever small town library and this is the next front of the culture war. But I think it's incredibly disconcerting when you have one monolithic bookseller that controls everything and has become, far more powerful over the last year during quarantine. And they say we are banning certain books that have been published by, legitimate journalists in many cases, or legitimate academics who may be controversial, but, work for universities that, receive state funding in many cases. So that's what's surprising to me is that, I don't think this is like a new front in the culture war, but it certainly has jumped from state to corporate in many ways. And that seems to feel, at least, new to me in a way that 5 years ago I don't think we could have ever envisioned big booksellers saying that they're not going to publish books from legitimate writers.
Right. And the other effect that has is there's the kind of self-censorship factor. Everybody knows that this can happen to you, so the rational thing that everybody's going to do is they're going to try to stay as far away from the line as they can in order to protect their jobs. Which means that the discourse is going to get even more homogenous and uninteresting and stupid. And so it's a terrible thing, I think. And I think this is much more it's much more dangerous than the moments when that were you think about from like Field of Dreams, right, where it's a small town where you mentioned where they might be trying to cancel J.D. Salinger or whatever it is. This is a massive global apparatus that has the ability to just completely wipe out an author's existence, and that's a new thing. I mean, it's Orwellian, it feels like to me.
I mean, this is the thing. Sorry, I'm going to turn commie for a second. Excuse me, Katherine and Marc, the VCs in the group. But it's odd that that's where we are, right? If you look back at the sort of rabble-rousers and firebrands of the past, say a Lenny Bruce, for example, to cite a comedian from the past who couldn't even perceive of our current age. But, when he gave his stand-up and like someone dragged him off the stage, it was like an NYPD cop and he was booked on obscenity charges and he went to jail, like this whole thing, right? Like it wasn't like General Motors showed up and like arrested him, or like he got into like a car and the car wouldn't start because General Motors canceled him or something. Like there was no conception that corporate power would actually sort of extend that far, right? But in the case of the government, right, in the sense that you can't opt out of a nation state, there's rule of law, there's notions of rights and this and that. But against the corporatocracy, there's nothing you can invoke in a sense. There's no principle, right, other than the market, which is not exactly democratic at the end of the day. So there's no tool. What do you do? There's nothing you can do against that the eBay Dr. Seuss censorship or whatever you call it, right? That's the problem.
Yeah, and this is what I've been trying to. I've had so many arguments with other people in the business about this, and what I hear from people who, I've worked with, who've been colleagues of mine, and I say this is a completely new way we're doing business now, right? We grew up in this system where if you made a mistake, the way they punished you was through the civil courts. The offended party had to prove that that you committed libel or defamation. They had to show actual damage, and if there was an offense, they tried to compensate the actual victim, but they didn't punish the speaker. They punished the speech. Now we're throwing all that out the window, and there was that old sort of transparent process, and we're going to this thing that's completely in the dark. And as you say, there's no thing you can appeal to if this happens to you. It just you're at the mercy of this kind of nameless star chamber of people who you don't even know where they are, who are making this decision. I just heard today from this guy Ford Fisher, he's pretty well known as a protest photographer. He's an independent, but he supplies a lot of footage to all the biggest news organizations. He goes to every street protest and he shoots everything. And he was basically just taken off YouTube, and that's his life. And they don't, and there's no way he can appeal that decision. He doesn't have a way to even find somebody to talk to about that. So it's crazy, I think.
It's funny, you refer to the Star Chamber, which, for those who don't get the historical reference, was a court in the 15th to 17th century Britain, in which dissidents would basically be persecuted. So it's just funny but that Star Chamber now exists inside a closed door conference room inside eBay or other tech companies, for example. And it's odd that in some sense the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, is actually like hipper and more open-minded than tech companies. Think about that for sort of a second. They're like chiller than the tech companies, right? SCOTUS.
That's right. Yeah, they're it's like a Berkeley Free Speech Society compared to what goes on in some of those companies, I guess. I don't know. The thing is, I have such difficulty imagining what the thought processes are like in those places. I would love to know more about that, but it's crazy. And I think the other scary thing about it is that we're reaching the point where there are not people who remember what it was like before, and so this is all normal to them. And the old system, or where you expected that you had rights, and you would have reacted automatically with outrage if you were taken down or if you had part of your business taken away or whatever it was. People, they don't respond that way anymore. They've kind of been conditioned to this new reality, it feels like to me, which is scary.
Right. That's the scary part, right? That it's like, I think, Matt, you and I are probably the same age. We're like the bridge generation that we remember like sending letters, but then we're totally plugged into like the virtual world. And it's like, we're not even that old really in the scheme of things, but it's like, you don't understand how much the world has changed in 20 years. This has totally changed. And it's the same thing for freedom of speech. It's like, do you realize if you had said this 20 years ago, you would literally have been like laughed out of any room in the United States. Mm-hmm. And yet suddenly we all live in fear. But,
Yeah, it's amazing. The views on speech have completely flipped. And yeah, you were asking before about, my political beliefs and the evolution of that. When I was growing up, liberalism was was believing in free speech and reacting with horror to people like Tipper Gore, and thumbing your nose at John Tower and Ed Meese and the Pornography Commission and Jerry Falwell, and now things have been completely turned on their head, and people are screaming for that kind of some kind of a censorship overlord to ferret out bad content, which is it's so crazy to me. I don't know where that instinct comes from.
Well, it's funny. Can I share an anecdote? I don't know.
Sure,
Did you want to? Yeah. Okay.
No, go for it.
Yeah. So one thing, it's funny. So again, when I was LARPing as a journalist in my sort of deluded stage that I could actually fix the conception of tech, so I went probably the only guy who went the other way, from tech to journalism. And probably the most interesting story I did was actually the underground internet scene in Cuba, which is a long story, but basically the internet's effectively either illegal or too expensive to use in Cuba. So I just, like you did in Uzbekistan, but perhaps without quite the fireworks. I wasn't 21, so I was not quite as self-destructive. So I managed to not get deported, but I was still reporting illegally. And what was fascinating about it, I've traveled lots of places, but the only time I've ever had the experience of living inside a police state in which there was a general pervasive feeling of fear, right? And when you live in fear, but you're like 3 generations into it, like it's not Stalin anymore, it's like Brezhnev. This has just become normalized. It's just the way it is, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone lives not just one lie. They live like an entire like a kaleidoscope of lies, right? Mm-hmm. And they live at various levels of deception. And you engage with them at one level, and they understand you're lying to them, but they lie with another thing. And it's just, and then everyone is sort of conspiring about everyone else. Like, oh, this person is this person's the other agent, and everyone. It's just this common feeling of lying and living in a sense of duplicitousness as a way to live. And anyhow, that just comes to mind sometimes these days.
No, absolutely. I mean, I didn't have as extensive probably an experience with that, but I went to college in the Soviet Union in the waning days of it in Leningrad, and I remember being fascinated by that exact thing, like this, all the different internal calculations that everybody was silently making all day long. So there were all these things that were unspoken that everybody knew, but nobody talked about. So, for instance, the rector at my university could walk into school with a brand new Western suit on that he had clearly bought with dollars from some black market person, and that was going to be fine because he was a party member. But the kid in my dorm who was selling jeans in the back, in the dormitory, he was going to get arrested for basically doing exactly the same thing, and that person was not allowed to have dollars on his person, whereas it would have been shameful for the party member to not be able to say they had dollars. So there was just stuff like that nobody talked about, but everybody knew. And I think, yeah, we're entering that same kind of weird dystopian place in America where we have all these different calculations about things that we just know, but we don't say, which is scary.
Right, we're living in a world of private truths but public lies as a generalized phenomenon in American life. Yeah.
Noam Chomsky recently, sort of came out against sort of the censorship, and someone tweeted, "Noam Chomsky calling you out for your excessive leftism is like Snoop Dogg telling you to lay off the weed."
Well, that's true though, right? That's how far it's gotten. I mean, it's crazy.
Matt, I want to go back to Trump just because you spent so much time covering him. Do you think he's done, or what's sort of the next what's the next episode or next season of either him and or his kids? What can we expect?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't know. I mean, I would have said no, that he's not done, but taking him off Twitter is really has been a major thing, and I don't know. I mean, it's just hard to imagine that he'll proceed and try to run for president again. I mean, would he even do that? I just can't. And there's no one else who can step into his act. It's unique to him. I mean, that was one of the features of the 2016 race, is that even though a lot of the candidates recognized on some level what he was doing, when they tried to imitate certain parts of the Trumpian routine, it just fell completely flat, and they were unable to reproduce it. He's the only person who can do what he does, which might be a good thing, but I just can't see. I don't know what the Republicans are going to do, because they have this massive audience that's furious, and I think probably would be likely to grow if they had any kind of coherent leadership. But I don't know what they're going to do unless it's Trump. It's hard to imagine.
Matt, what do you think of the idea that, given the results of the recent election, that the Republican future is not like a post-Trumpian redux, but in fact a multicultural sort of populist party instead?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible, and that was a very, very unpopular observation to make after the election. That because there were some amazing results about the last election. That Trump got more votes than he had the last time, and he improved with every ethnic group except I think white men. Right? Is that right? I think that's right.
Correct.
And so it's completely counter narrative, and again, if you talk to ordinary people, it's really not hard to see where that's coming from. There's just this enormous groundswell of people who just can't stand the ethos of kind of, I don't know, the modern cultural consensus. They just hate it. They feel left out. They feel like they're not part of it. They feel like they don't have a say in it. And they're just very, they want to negate it as strongly as possible. And that was, I think, what filled Trump's sails in the 2016 race. But that's only gotten bigger, and I think it's spread to different kinds of people since 2016. So yeah, if there was somebody to come along who was able to harness it, because it clearly also exists on the other side of the spectrum too, and also among people who don't identify as either side, like me. All right, like I never voted anything but Democrat in my life until this year. And this year I didn't vote. And there's probably a lot of people like that out there. I mean, I know there are. So it's interesting. It would have to take a certain set of circumstances for it to happen. But there's clearly the potential for that kind of a movement to take place, I think. I mean, what do you think, Antonio?
Well, I mean, that would presume I have political opinions. And again, continuing with our private truth, public lies thing, I, of course, believe in the opinions of the party. As a sort of tenuously hanging on member of the outer party, I'm happy to stay there with my victory gin. But I'm curious, Matt, if there were a political candidate, who would you vote for? Like, design your Franken candidate. If you want to talk about it. If not, we can shift topics and we can talk about something else. I don't want to put you on the spot, but we are talking about politics. I'm curious, who would come on the scene? Who would be your providential man or woman who would rescue the American political experiment from itself?
Yeah, I don't know.
Come on, okay, let's frame it a different way. Who's your favorite American president?
My favorite American president? Wow.
Oh, come on. Like, you haven't thought about this in the past? Come on. I'll tell you mine. How about that?
Sure, yeah. Tell me. Why don't you start? Go.
Teddy Roosevelt, progressive candidate. There you go.
Okay, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, I don't really think about favorite politicians that way. I don't like the way I think about baseball players or writers. To me, my sort of default position with politicians is that they're scum unless proven otherwise. So, yeah, it's tough. I had very high hopes for Barack Obama at one time. I really, after watching a lot of real dolts on the campaign trail, I was impressed initially with, his intelligence and his communicative ability, and then he just was such a disappointment on so many levels as president. I love. This is probably gonna mark me as a nerd, but I really.
Andrew Yang.
No. Dennis Kucinich. I loved. I got.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
Wow, dude, that's old school. Okay.
Yeah, he was sort of he was the first politician that I actually got along with personally. Covering on the campaign trail, he's just a really weird guy who, but he really cares, and that means a lot to me for when it comes to politicians. Like, do they have any kind of sincere bone in their body at all? That's important, because it's not that common. Most politicians, by the time they get to the level of being senators or candidates for president, their humanity has been firmly driven out of them. So any signs of honesty at all or actual devotion to any kind of principle, doesn't even matter what it is, I'm always very impressed by that. That's one of the things I initially liked about Bernie Sanders, even though I didn't agree with a lot of his ideas. It was clear to me what a lot of his motivations were, and those were really interesting, and so I always admired that about him. So yeah, I think any politician who can have communicate sort of genuineness is going to succeed. And what's so odd about that is that's I think what was responsible for Trump winning. Even though Trump is so famous for being a liar, he came across to people as exactly what he was saying he was, and you could see his true nature without too much effort. There wasn't some hidden monstrous little organism or a mask or anything there, or he was all mask. I don't know. It's difficult with him, but yeah, I don't know. We'd have to see. I like Tulsi Gabbard too, a lot, as just somebody I think has a potential to talk to both wings of this country, which is increasingly difficult.
Matt, what is your ideal form of government?
So I'm not.
Other than rule by Substack authors, which we understand would certainly be interesting, at least. I suspect C-SPAN would be a lot more amusing, at the very least, if it was like you and like Greenwald and Sullivan going at it instead of whoever is on there now, who's geriatric and probably on Alzheimer's meds, but whatever.
Who watches C-SPAN, by the way?
Is that your late night guilt watch? C-SPAN,
no,
really?
No,
I watch Russian fight videos on YouTube. That's my late night, which is probably analogous to the C-SPAN thing, but way more kinetic than you would normally see on there.
That's great. Like actual like boxing fights or fights?
It turns out that everybody in Russia has a dash cam on their car to avoid insurance fraud, and it also turns out that literal street brawls, like with highway driving, are remarkably common in Russia as well.
Well, that's true.
So the combination of both of those together creates a sort of Russia's, America's home video type scenario that's really quite something.
Yeah, Russia's like a country that was invented for reality TV. Like,
Right.
It's unfortunate that Americans haven't recognized its potential yet. They actually had a reality show there when I was still there, where the premise of the show was that you actually had to steal a car.
Yeah.
So they were, but yeah, the whole
Reality
country.
TV show. If that's the most popular TV show in your country, it turns out every invader gets sent packing within like 6 months. Like no one even manages to get to Moscow and last longer than like a month before it turns into like Grand Theft Auto Moscow, and Napoleon is just sent packing way back to Paris. It's over.
Well, that's definitely one of the things that you learn to love about Russians is that country is completely disorganized. There isn't a right angle in the entire, the entire country. But yeah, no one can manage that country except them. It's an amazing thing. But ideal form of government. I mean, I'm kind of a person who believes that we're not so terribly far away from things working all that well, or working quite well, and I like the system of trying to have power dispersed as much as possible. So the concept of three branches of government, checks and balances. I think there should be more power, should be more decentralized. There should be a little bit more federalism, a little bit more self-government, a little bit more autonomy, and with a few tweaks here and there, I think we'd basically be doing fine. I'm kind of optimistic in that sense. I think a little bit like I don't know, maybe like a less lefty version of Paul Goodman, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I'm definitely not a socialist, or don't have any sort of yearnings for utopia or anything like that.
But do you hold Bitcoin, Matt?
I don't. Should I?
Yeah. I mean, this is not investment. Matt,
Are you from Jersey? He's got Krugerrand under his mattress. What are you talking about? Bitcoin is like this newfangled idea.
Matt, gearing towards closing, two closing questions for you. One is, what's your next book? And two is, 30 years from now, or a few decades from now, what do you want people to say about your work? Like, what do you think that that legacy is going to, or what do you hope that legacy is going to look like?
Well, I'm not writing a book right now because I'm on Substack, and so for so long in my life I was, doing full-time reporting at Rolling Stone and writing a book at the same time, which was a real grind, and I have 3 kids, so I probably will write one eventually, though. I mean, I think what I'd really like to do, and this is I know people, I'm gonna get killed for saying this, but I would love to take one of these sort of loony campus controversies and report it out. Interview 500 people, everybody involved, and sort of write it up like a novel.
Brett Weinstein is in the audience.
Oh, is he? Yeah. I think I might have even talked to him about that once. It's a, that would be, I think, fascinating. I think looking back, people are going to look back at this era and probably think that those stories were incredible. But in terms of what I hope people say about me 30 years from now, I don't know. I used to, again, when I was a kid, my ambition was to write great books and be somebody like, Raymond Chandler or Gogol or Evelyn Waugh, and I now know that that's never going to happen, right? So, my ambition is to be probably remembered as somebody who was a good writer, and that somebody who people still read, 50 or 60 years from now, which would be great. People still read H.L. Mencken. and think of him as a really interesting and funny, witty writer, even though he wasn't like a classic literary figure. So that's something I can kind of sort of hope is possible, but who knows?
I think we have present a major fan of Mencken who's been silent the entire evening, Marc Andreessen. Oh,
I'm coming. Yeah, no, Matt, it's amazing you actually bring up Mencken. I love reading. The thing that's so striking about Mencken is he was writing like literally 100 years ago, and his prose style is almost completely modern. Does it strike you that way also?
Absolutely, and I think that's kind of the mark of a great periodical writer, is that they kind of invent a language that's timeless and doesn't date itself. I mean, he doesn't read like none of his phrases seem antiquated.
Right.
It just seems powerful and funny, and like a correct, incandescent use of the English language, which is just amazing, right? So even somebody else who I love from that time period, like Raymond Chandler, you read that book and the language is firmly placed in that time period. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, Mencken could, with minor tweaks, could easily be somebody writing today, which is amazing.
Yeah, and then the two other things that always struck me about him, one is, I'm sure you're aware, he was like an early, basically, acolyte of Nietzsche in the United States, and actually wrote one of the great books on Nietzsche. And so, like, a guy with like serious philosophical grounding, and I think he was a Nietzsche translator too, if I remember right, which is fairly impressive. And then the other thing that just like jumps off the page when you read Mencken is like, boy, could he heap scorn on politicians. Like, I mean, like,
it's amazing. Yeah.
Like you obviously have that talent also, but like, man, he felt about like Warren Harding the way that like, people feel about Trump these days, or, that like, and like, or, the people maybe feel about Bernie or whatever, like, or Biden, like he just like, I mean, and like, I would say like encyclopedically for years, like his columns are actually really funny to read, because like every column he would come up with a new way to whack at Harding. And it's almost I go so far as to say it's almost reassuring to read him, because at least his description of politicians 100 years ago, like all of us, it's like by comparison, it's like maybe things aren't actually, I don't know, maybe things aren't actually so bad now, or maybe things actually haven't changed that much. Like maybe they really actually were that bad 100 years ago also.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you're right. He was amazing in that respect. So I think Mark Twain's Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses was kind of the first example that I can remember of just somebody who, writing for something like a periodical, setting out to just completely decimate another human being. And Twain incinerates Cooper in that essay. It's just like, it's one of the funniest things ever written. Mencken's like, his whole career was basically that. And he had a very dim view of basically all politicians, but also like most people too. I mean,
yes, that's so true.
I remember talking to him. There's a phrase that he wrote once, something to the effect of like, in America, like the general level of competence and intelligence is so low that any man who has read 4 good books and does not fear ghosts stands out like a walt, stands out as brilliantly as a wart on a bald head. But his whole routine was that, but it was beautiful, I mean, it's a particular kind of thing. It's not building a story, but boy was he good at that.
Yeah, well, he also famously said, that I forget what it was, exact phrasing, but like, one day basically the great masses of like American, basically like voters participating in this great democratic experiment will finally get their heart's desire and will appoint to the highest office of the land a total idiot.
And he was right.
He was right.
He also said, democracy is the theory that common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard.
Exactly. Hopefully we've generated at least a handful of new Mencken readers tonight.
Yeah, no, he's incredible. and I always thought his, people get on him for his politics, but I always thought his sort of general attitude towards politicians was generally the correct one, which was, they're guilty until proven innocent, until proven otherwise.
Right.
So.
Exactly.
I think that's a good place to wrap. This has been an excellent conversation. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun, and I'm glad to have finally come on Clubhouse. So thank you to all of you.
I was going to ask you as a footnote, what did you make of Clubhouse? What do you think of the experience?
I was nervous at first, but it's cool. I think it's clearly going to take off, and it's I really enjoy it, and I think it's Twitter has finally run its course. I think it's no longer the thing. I think this is going to be the thing. It feels like to me. Does it feel like that to you?
Yeah.
I think, well, I mean, this is a longer story and it's late, but I think they run along different modes. One is sort of like textual culture, the other is oral culture. But I think they're definitely complementary in a sense, but I think they're very different modes of interacting with the world. But
what I like about it though is that so Twitter is a format that really encourages people to gang up on each other and definitely encourages those piranha-like feeding frenzies, whereas this feels like something where you're actually trying to reach out and talk to other people and find common ground, which is so much healthier and more interesting. So love it. I think it's a cool thing, and I'm really glad for it.
Yeah, I think the key thing is that it actually replicates the dynamics of oral culture, whereby like if you're talking to a real human, and like most humans are not sociopathic enough to like, form a mob to your face, right? While on Twitter, it's very easy to do with like a retweet button or whatever, and it's kind of like low cost. But if you have to if every time you were like snitch tagging somebody or retweeting, like you instantly saw a photo of them with like their family and hugging their kids, I guarantee you Twitter engagement would like plummet by like 98%, right? Because it literally is a combination of like the worst elements of oral culture and the worst elements of textual culture all mixed together in one bag, and everyone's on it. While I think Clubhouse is like, well, no, it's the better parts of oral culture, but there's nowhere to share this. Tomorrow, people are going to say, oh, I missed that thing with Taibbi because it was great. It's like, sorry, it's just gone. You weren't there. It was like, speaking of being old farts, remember back when like you had to be there, like a thing just happened and there was no trace of it. There was no index. There was no link. There was nowhere to reshare it. There was no memeing of it. That's it. You either were there or you weren't. If you weren't there, you missed it, right? And that's the Clubhouse dynamic in a way.
Well, that was what was so weird about the Poynter Institute, that they came out with that article complaining, or was it the Neiman Institute?
It was Poynter.
One of those fuckers, whatever. They're all the same. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, they were complaining that you couldn't fact check effectively because there was no transcript, and I think life doesn't come with a transcript, right? I mean, it was just such a weird.
Dude, if these fuckers were at the Gettysburg Address, they'd be sitting there like, putting, links to fucking Snopes saying, oh, Lincoln said the wrong thing. It's ridiculous. They're just missing the entire point of the goddamn thing.
Exactly.
Okay, everybody. Matt, thanks again for joining. We'll see everybody back for Tuesday for the next week on Big Ideas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Bye. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Take care, everybody.
Wow, that was intense.